Hello, and welcome back to another installment of Perligo Ponders, in which I respond to your comments, questions, and theories about my own comments, questions, and theories related to the lore and music of 21 Pilots. As always, if you would like your own comment to be featured in the next episode, simply leave a comment asking an interesting question or proposing a compelling theory. You can feel free to flag it as Perligo Ponders if you would like, but I don't just pull comments with that flag for inclusion in these episodes. Let's get into it. All right, this first question comes from an anonymous user who asks, I thought about Blurryface a little bit. Do you think the whole storyline actually begins with Jumpsuit and Heavy Dirty Soul, and its whole album is actually the beginning of the final cycle? Consider Stressed Out, the line, "My name's Blurryface," may be telling us that this version of Nico from Breach's Clancy trying one last time to make a song. Also, Ride might be an extension of Heavy Dirty Soul between the escape and the final Clancy waking up back in the car. I might be reading into it too much. So the whole storyline begins with Jumpsuit and Heavy Dirty Soul. Jumpsuit's not on Blurryface, so that part's a little confusing. Could Blurryface, essentially, this seems to be what he's asking, could Blurryface be the beginning, as a whole album, be the beginning of the final cycle? And then everything we see from Blurryface onwards is a continuation of that final cycle. And there have been other cycles that came before, but those aren't outlined or illustrated in the story that we get through the lore albums. All the lore albums from Blurryface through Breach are related to this one final cycle. And I think in a lot of ways this is kind of a common mainstream almost theory of what we see here in the story in the lore albums, that this is all one final cycle that's taking place, the Trench Saga. I think it is and it isn't, right? I think the way I've always interpreted it and the way I've always understood it to be playing out is that rather than what we see being just the final cycle, although we do see the final cycle play out, we are also given glimpses of previous cycles in a number of different ways. And that's why the Clancy video contradicts other things that we see, or at the very least contradicts other things that we read. So whereas on the visual side, perhaps largely everything we see visually is all part of one final cycle, I do think there are elements throughout everything else that we're given in the story of other cycles sort of being told simultaneously to this final cycle. The story is being told in a non-linear fashion almost, while still being told in a linear fashion. So we have the final cycle happening, and then throughout that narrative arc of the final cycle, as it's being told to us, we almost get like these flashbacks forcing their way in to previous cycles that have taken place. And so we get information from those previous cycles and things like the letters in Clancy's journal, and things like parts of music videos that don't quite make sense, flashbacks and city walls that don't line up with videos that we actually saw. You know, the events of Heavy Dirty Soul where we see, or the events, of Jumpsuit in relation to Heavy Dirty Soul, where we see two Tylers or two Clancys at play with one another, one having knowledge of what the other's doing, but not actually there at the same time as he is, but almost there at the same time as he is, right? The Jumpsuit as a music video almost illustrates what I'm trying to say here, where we have one narrative arc playing while another one forces its way into that narrative. But it's a previous Clancy, it's a previous version, or it's a future one. That's a matter for debate. I think it's a previous one. But regardless, it could be either. And so I think all of this that we see in this final story, or this final cycle that's told throughout the whole story, from Blurryface to Breach, is actually kind of a number of cycles sandwiched together and told as one. And that sort of understanding, that way of looking at this arc, this narrative, helps me at least understand or come to terms with a lot of the discrepancies and misalignments between the different narratives that we're given, if that makes sense. A comment came in from Spotify from a fellow named Eustace. Eustace says, the dragon is called Trash. Could that be related to Garbage from Breach? Also, Josh Dunn sang in Drum Show and Stressed Out on tour. Do you think he will continue to at least occasionally sing? In answer to that second question, yes, I do. I think they're incorporating him singing in these performances more and more. Obviously, in the Clancy tour, he was doing Paladin Street Bandito mashup as well. And I think he did some stuff in Stressed Out with that one. Certainly the movie had plenty of jokels, as we call them. So yes, short answer to that second question, yes. Could the dragon Trash be related to the song Garbage? Maybe. My inclination would be to say no, simply given that the fact that I don't think Garbage really relates to the lore all that much. And Trash, from my understanding, and if my memory serves me correctly, is a name related to a sort of in-universe name for vultures being called trash dragons, and then bringing that name and that imagery to life in a dragon, then kind of naming the dragon trash because vultures are called trash dragons, if that makes sense. I think in short, no. Could it be related? Yeah, maybe. I just don't actually think the themes between those two songs, or not songs, between the song Garbage, the themes of that song, and the character of Trash really line up all that much. Next up, we have a comment from NDR4432. For Perligo, do you think that Blurryface named himself that way because the last thing he saw when he was Clancy, or the equivalent to Clancy in his time, was a blurry face? And City Walls, the shot after Clancy getting stabbed, is Nico's face being blurry from Clancy's POV. That might be what the previous hero saw too, and it made him name himself Blurryface when he eventually became a bishop. I actually really like this theory. I don't know that there's a ton of like hard evidence for it. I don't know that there's really any indication in anything that this is the case beyond that shot in City Walls, but I think it's actually a really interesting idea and a really interesting theory. It's a possibility. Again, it's one of those things where it's like the history of dema. We can only really speculate on it. We can't know for sure because it isn't like a clue that's waiting to be solved, because there isn't something to be solved for something like this. But I do really like that idea. That figure of Blurryface has always kind of blurred his face. He's always had a blurry face from everywhere that we've seen him, with that veil in front of his face blurring it. Could it be that he sort of, that the Clancy that became Nico, who called himself Blurryface, died in similar fashion to the Clancy that we see in the final cycle? And so he as he was fading away, he sees that blurry face of Nico, and then he adopts that name almost as an intimidation tactic to, and incorporates it into what the rest of the bishops wear. They all wear these blurry veils over their faces as well. But the new bishops at the end of City Walls don't. Clancy doesn't put that veil over his face. He just puts the hood on, and we don't really see the faces of the other bishops that are joining him, but it doesn't seem like they have those veils on. And so it could be that look and that idea is something that is very specific to the blurry face regime. And so as he died and became Nico or whatever and was corrupted, he saw that vision of a blurry face, and thinking back on it once he was a bishop, he was like, oh, that could be a really intimidating, foreboding sort of image to present to the citizens that I want to keep subdued. I think this is an interesting idea. Next up, we have a comment from FINXNV1975 or 1975. To me, the empty set symbol represents a void with infinite possibilities, which to me defines creativity, creating, which will then indicate that there is a solution. Within the void of infinite possibilities, this is why this story's not over. Like you say, they are done telling their part. The rest is up to us. I pulled this out to talk about mainly because I thought it was an interesting sort of counter-interpretation, in a sense, of the empty set symbol and sort of what that represents, as opposed to it just being something that's null and void, but it being a symbol that represents this idea of infinite possibilities, of a number of, or infinite number of possible endings to this story. And how, while he might fail time and time again, at some point he will succeed, just as a matter of probability or whatever, just as a matter of, given how many possibilities there are to the ending, at some point you have to hit on a successful one. I don't know that this is necessarily the most hopeful interpretation. I think there's a sense in which it seems like there's a desire to have it be a hopeful interpretation of the empty set symbol. But certainly the possibility that Clancy could be stuck in this cycle, stuck trying to break free of this cycle to a near infinite extent, doesn't seem very hopeful or very promising for his future. But I think this is certainly an interesting and somewhat fresh way to look at the empty set symbol, given, well, it's just different. It's a different perspective on this idea that's been a question for a number of episodes of Perligo Ponders, about what the empty set symbol really represents within the lore and the story, because it's such a prominent symbol in many ways, and certainly it's a prominent symbol for the Bourbaki group, who has an influence on the lore, as we know. Next, we have this comment from Rob Del Tony. To clarify, my theory is based on the assumption that for the foreseeable future, the cycle isn't broken, which also implies that Nico was once a Clancy before succumbing to the way of the bishops and becoming one himself. That's not to say the cycle will never be broken, but breaking the cycle isn't the point. The point is that in the midst of trying to break the cycle, there are two sides that the listener has to pick from. Are you going to side with Blurryface or Clancy? It actually sort of ties in with that last empty set symbol theory by Abbey Weiss, clearly a different empty set symbol theory to the one that we were just working on or looking at. There isn't a solution to breaking the cycle, but you can learn, grow, and do better each time the cycle starts again. Maybe one day the cycle will be broken, but until then, what's your choice? I hope that makes more sense. Feel free to include the follow-up in another Perligo Ponders if you feel so inclined. At the very least, this is an interesting bit of context to sort of what he was presenting before, which from my understanding was related to the ending of the All Flightless Birds and this idea that you have to kind of pick and choose between the two kind of representations of good and evil that are presented to us. We have Clancy representing the good, Nico representing the bad. It's time to pick your fight, right? And so his point here, which I think is actually a very good point, is that even if you are not going to break the cycle this time, or the next time, or the time after that, even if for a while you're going to be struggling to break free, it's still very important to continue choosing the path of goodness, the right path, the good path, the true path, even when all hope seems to be lost, because you know that there's sort of a fundamental truth you're still gripping hold of, that is still the way to go despite whatever despair might be facing you. All that is to say, I think this is a really cool way of looking at it, and I think one that makes a lot of sense, that, you know, it's not just about winning, quote unquote, or losing, it's about enduring in a lot of ways. It's about holding true to the good, true, and beautiful, even when everything around you seems to be full of darkness. And it seems like the darkness is always going to prevail. You can't see that glimmer of hope anymore. But even so, despite that, you still choose to follow the good path. 2 more questions from this episode of Perligo Ponders. Next, we have a poet Y6C. Frankly, I think Drag Path is about death. Your struggles are there your entire life, and the only time they end is when you eventually die, when the devil comes to kill you. For a religious person, this is actually hopeful, because it means you're going to go rest with God. It is hopeful, but at the same time doesn't try to make the claim that your struggles are just going to go away. I'm not entirely sure what that last sentence means, but I do appreciate the kind of interpretation and the idea that Drag Path is describing death, or sort of, with the idea being not that Clancy lost to death or lost to vialism by taking his own life in that context, but more that Drag Path is describing the end of this struggle that comes at the end of life. Sort of similar to the comment we were just looking at, where this idea is not necessarily that you're going to break the cycle or break free completely. This may be something you can constantly battle your entire life. And it's only really at the end of your life, after you've lived a full life to the fullest, to the best of your ability, choosing the good constantly as much as you can throughout your life, that you then get this final, I guess, rest, or your story is actually completed on your deathbed kind of thing, in your dying days. I'm not going to say I'm like 100% behind it, but I do appreciate it. I think it's a good way of looking at that song, or at least a very interesting way, a very interesting interpretation. This is the final question of this episode from that Troll Juice 2. For Perligo Ponders, do you think the events of Skilled and Icy happened to Nico in his cycle? Or do you think a different series of events took place instead? This is the kind of question that I think there really is no way of answering, other than to say there's a very good chance that it did. Because what we see in the journal and the letters in so many ways doesn't line up with what we see visually, that it very much makes me wonder if the journal is not written by the Clancy we see in the final cycle and we follow through the music videos. The journal might be a collection of numerous previous Clancys, not just one, but it at the very least isn't the current Clancy. And so because of that would indicate that at least 2 Clancys have gone through that part of the cycle. And so the previous cycle, Clancy becoming Nico, is also going through that step, is also trapped in dema, also creates Skilled and Icy, or a version of it in his own way. And then, because maybe he creates a musical performance for them, but it isn't quite Skilled and Icy, it's his own version of it, right? But something along those lines happens to multiple. I think that's a very real possibility. Again, can we know for sure? Not really, but I do think if we understand that the journals to be written by multiple Clancys, or at least different Clancys to the one we see visually in the final cycle, or the final depicted cycle, not the one that completed the story and broke free, then that would indicate that it is. All right, well, with that being said, that brings us to the end of Perligo Ponders. As always, if you'd like your own comment or question to be featured in the next episode, simply comment something below. Feel free to flag it with the Perligo Ponders flare if you would like, but I don't just pull comments with that flare or that tag. Thank you for watching that segment.